Okay, me again, Beth Mendelsohn. I'm with the Owl Research Institute, and we are located in Charlotte, Montana. So not too far from here. We're a really small nonprofit organization. We focus on owl research, obviously, but we also do small mammal research and other raptors and some other bird work. And today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about mostly short-eared owls and the research that we've done on short-eared owls for the past over 30 years, really. I don't have a clicker, so I'm going to be pointing at just with this feather throughout the presentation, so that's why. Okay, so again, if you want to check out our website, we have some great info in back. We have a lot of good information on the website. I'll tell you more about all the other projects that we do, who we are. We also do education and conservation and research, so all those things. Who has seen a short-eared owl or short-eared owls? Raise them high. Okay, so about half of you in here. So we'll just go over some basic facts real quick on the short-eared owl. They're a medium-sized owl. They're about 1 pound or a little bit less, about 1 foot tall. I've got one over here. So, you know, this one looks a little smaller just because its feathers are kind of matted down, but medium-sized owl, but they do have a fairly large wingspan. So if you see them flying, it's going to look like a larger bird, about a 3-foot wingspan on the bird. They have the rounded facial disc, and they actually have short ear tufts. And I get asked all the time, why are they called a short-eared owl? And this is an owl's ear, okay? So it's long, actually. It's not short. That's a long ear. That's a great gray, but that just shows you the ear structure of an owl is actually internal. It's behind the facial disc. It's not anything that sticks out of the head. So short-eared owl often looks like this. Rounded facial disc, doesn't look like it has any kind of ear. And then you can see on this one, right up top here, little ear tufts starting to come up. There's another view, and from the back, go ahead. And so the short-eared owl actually can control how these tufts go up and go down. So when you see the owl, you may or may not see what appears to be ears. And that contrasts with the long-eared owl, where again, it's not an ear, it's an ear tuft, just a feather. And on the long-eared owl, they're just a little bit longer. So that's where they got their name. I don't think it's the best name since they're not, you know, ears, but I think we're stuck with it for now. Okay, so the short-eared owl is located really all around the globe. There's about 10 recognized subspecies of short-eared owl. So here you can see the red is the breeding regions, purple is breeding and non-breeding, and blue is non-breeding. And so there's subspecies all over the world, and we're actually part of a new working group that's forming an international working group to study some of these subspecies. So we'll all collaborate around the world, gather samples, and do a large genomic study to really find out if there's any genomics behind the subspecies and different morphological things that we're seeing in locations. So we're excited to be a part of that in the next probably 5 or 10 years it'll take. And then in Montana, this is just a map of the density of observations of short-eared owls in our state. Right here is where the Owl Institute does most of its research, so you can see a hot spot there. You guys, a lot of you have probably been to the Mission Valley, Duck Road, Nine Pipes area to see short-eared owls, so that's where we do our research. But all around the state, there's a lot of hot spots, a lot of good spots for short-eared owls. And that's because we have habitat that they like, and what they like is what we call open country. And around here, that's mostly grasslands. It can sometimes be agricultural fields, sagebrush, things like that, but we mainly see them around here in the grasslands. Okay, so we study a lot of our owl species year-round. So today I'm going to kind of go through the short-eared owl and what we do with that species year-round, starting with winter, which is kind of an understudied portion of the short-eared owl's life cycle. Really, we don't know a whole lot about what they do during winter, and our study is really one of the few that I know of in the world that actually studies the short-eared owl in the field in the winter to try to find out more about their populations. So one of the things that we are able to do is look at their communal roosts. And a communal roost just means more than one bird. So 2 or more owls roosting or basically sleeping together during the day. So they can be in a group of 2 all the way up to 50, 60, a lot of owls. And so it's kind of nice, they're all congregated in little groups and we're able to study them. And we're kind of trying to figure out why are they doing that? Why do they roost communally? And one way we can do that is to look at some of these videos that we've gotten from their roosts to see what kind of behavior is going on. Like there are 2 there kind of, you know, doing the kissy kissy. And then here, this one in the deep snow really wants to get into that roost, but this one, other one is not having it. It says, no, this is my spot. You get out of there. And that one leaves. And we see this a lot where they're just all very observant and all watching. Same thing that happens. And so we're using some of this video data to learn about why they're communally roosting. What are they getting from this? Is there anything to gain? And so seeing some of those social behaviors really starts to tell us, well, they probably are having like some kind of social benefit. Maybe they're meeting their mates. Maybe the younger birds are learning from the older birds, find spots, how to hunt. Maybe there's some kind of social hierarchy. Things like that that we can actually observe, which has been really hard to observe because of their habitat, because they're so hidden and because they flush. So it's not that easy to get a camera on them. I'll go ahead and play that one. Here's another example. You can see this one's been here a while. There's a whole group of pellets there. We were able to watch this bird doing some interesting preening behaviors and things like that. And they all just come and go from the roosts in and out throughout the night and then settle in during the day. So that's some of the information we've been getting. Go ahead. And they're roosting on the ground, obviously. So we can use that to our advantage a little bit. We can do walking surveys to try and count them. And here's a picture of some of you actually doing surveys. If you've done one of these Trojan Owl surveys with me, raise your hand or stand up again. Okay, so a lot of you here, Jake and Carol and Laura and Pam and Rod, and sorry if I missed some of you, but Michelle, yes, have been doing these surveys with us for the past couple years. And what we do is we all go out in a group and we walk transects through the grasslands. We're braving whatever winter weather is thrown at us. A lot of these foggy, frosty days, some of these beautiful sunny days. And with that volunteer help, we're able to actually count how many owls are in these areas. Where are they? And what are they doing? So here is one of the ways that we measure the roost. So John's at a roost site that he found, and he's going to take some measurements. He's going to mark where that spot is, and he's going to count how many owls are in there. So we're starting to put some numbers to how many owls are there, what is the group size, and where are they. Here's an example of some of the winter roosts and what they look like. Here's one where I call this kind of an umbrella, where there's a canopy over the owl. And what we're starting to find in our data is that especially on these cold, frosty, snowy times of year, the owls are choosing really hidden locations where they can get out of the elements. They're backed up against thick clumps of grass here, or under grasses that are giving them a little bit of shelter and where there's not as much snow on the ground. And then when we start to get a buildup of snow, like over a foot or more, we don't see as many owls generally. And where we do find them is areas where there's extra tall grasses or along the edges of canals or places where they can shelter out of the elements. But then on nicer days, what we'll see is milder temperatures, sun. The owls actually move away from those sheltered roosts, more out in the open, and start to soak up the sun a little bit and take advantage of that. So we can kind of see a shift in their roost site selection just over time. This graph shows you, just starting from November of 23, in one area that we survey, how many owls we're finding each month. So we try to do the survey one time per month. And this shows you that there's just a lot of variation. The owls are coming and going. They're not always there. They're not always in the same spot. They may come back, they may not, they may go to a different spot. So we're just trying to look to start to find out, are there any patterns to that? Where are they? Why are they there? Next graph. This graph shows us the years, and I have these grouped as like a winter season. So that's why there's 2 different years. And since 2020, when we've been doing this, we've seen a lot of fluctuation in the number of owls that we see in each area. So it can be as high as 120 almost owls per kilometer square, or it can be as low as, this is like maybe 5 owls per square kilometer in the same areas during different winters. And what we've also noticed is that when there are more owls in general around, there's bigger roost sizes. So if you have more owls, you're also going to have larger groups of owls together. And you can see that some of these roosts are pretty large. Max roost size here is in yellow. And so in the years when we have a lot of owls, we might see 50 owls in one roost. And if you can just imagine like the carpeted area of this room, I would call that like a roost. So you can have up to 80 owls all in that area. They may be clumped in little groups and spread out a little bit, and then we'll get some around. But they're really just in these communal roosts all together. And then in those years where there's a lot of owls, we'll see them in different spots. So multiple communal roosts within a square kilometer. Okay, go ahead. So why is this happening? One of the reasons is probably because of the food supply. And in the Mission Valley, the food supply for the short-eared owls is voles, both meadow voles and montane voles. Depending on the year, those populations can fluctuate a little bit. And so we think that when there's more voles, there's more owls, and we're starting to see a pretty good correlation between those two things. Go ahead. And so we call short-eared owls nomadic. And nomadic is basically, it's not exactly a migrant, it's not exactly a resident, but it's this movement strategy where the owls can sort of just move wherever, whenever. There's a lot of variation in it. And like we saw in those graphs, numbers can fluctuate from month to month and from year to year. We know the owls are coming and going a lot. So here's a range map that shows you where they breed, blue and green, and then where they're just wintering in orange, which kind of makes you think they're, migrating south for the winter, like a lot of birds. And that's not necessarily the case with short-eared owls. While there is like an overall range shift to the south, we think it's more movements in search of food. And now we're also finding that, okay, maybe some of these movements are also for social reasons, mating behavior, habitat, things like that. So it's something that can be really difficult to study. Where are the owls going? But some people have started doing that by using transmitters on birds. And while there haven't been very many short-eared owls with transmitters, the ones that have been successful have shown these kind of random short to long distance movements, anywhere from a couple 100 miles to a few thousand miles. And that can be between a season. It can be even within a season. For example, there was one short-eared owl female that was banded nesting in Wyoming, and then it moved and it nested again in Oregon. So we can see that it was moving within the same season. So that's one thing that with this international working group that we're hoping to figure out a little bit more about their movements. Where are they going, when, why? Okay, so one really neat thing about short-eared owls is that we can easily observe them. So it makes them, in a way, a little bit easier for us to study because they're in the open country and because they often are active in the dusk hours before it gets dark and sometimes early in the morning. And so we're able to go out and actually observe these birds. And I highly suggest anybody who hasn't seen one to try to do that. You can go to the Mission Valley and take a look at them. And so in the winter, we've learned that they're in these communal roosts, then they're moving around, they may be moving to different areas. And then starting right about now in March, we start to see more movements. The roost sizes get smaller. The areas generally have fewer owls, and we know that the owls are moving towards their breeding sites. And right now is that period that we're in. So what we do now is we go out and we look for courtship displays for short-eared owls. And it's this really special display that short-eared owls do to lead up to the mating season. And what we'll see the males do, I'll show a video actually first. The male is going to fly around and hoot. This is That's fine. So the male flies around and he makes that hooting sound, and then he dives down and he actually beats his wings underneath him to make that clapping sound. And we'll see them do that at really great heights, a few 100 feet up in the air or sometimes low. And if you watch them do this and look sort of under the male, sometimes you'll see that there's actually a female down there that they're displaying to. And so it seems that this display is somehow getting them a mate, you know, kind of like if, you know, all you guys were to stand up and do your dance moves over here, which I won't make you do right now, I guess, but then the females might decide, okay, well, that guy's got the moves, that guy not so much, and you pair up. So something like that, where the males are using this display to attract mates. We also see them grappling with other males and trying to form their territory. So they're going to sort of stake out where their nesting territory is, pick that territory, find their female, and then defend that from other males. And this is one area, a pretty small area, 1 kilometer and a little bit across, where we do our study. And you can see that all of these nests throughout the years have been in similar areas. And so in the years where we have a lot of nests, we have a lot of males displaying, there's more territories, and they can actually be pretty close together at times. And we think that depends on the available food and habitat. So their territoriality can actually change a little bit from year to year. And the other thing that we see from this map here is that over the years, different colors are different years. You can see that they're sort of using the same spots even in different years. And so we're interested in looking into that a little bit more with our genetics to figure out, okay, are they the same owls? Are they related owls? And looking at that with habitat, are they just selecting for these specific habitat areas, and therefore birds in different years are going to select for the same things, and that's why they're ending up in those same spots year after year. Unfortunately, we don't do a lot of banding, and so we don't get a lot of data from banding and recapturing. They're not an easy bird to capture. So with the nests, we do look at habitat as well, like we do with the roosts. And we want to know what types of species are they using, what type of grass height do they need, density of grass, things like that. Here are some of the common species that we find them nesting in the Mission Valley. Some of these are native, most of them are not. And what we're starting to conclude from that is that it may not be that important what grass species or plant species is available, as long as it has a certain composition to it. Does it provide the appropriate cover? Can the desired food live there? Things like that. Although we do see a little bit of a preference for some of the more native bunching wheat grasses that's starting to emerge. Okay, so there, you didn't give him a chance to see it. This is a photo that we took from a drone. This is one way that we go and check up on nests, because we find that the nests can be pretty sensitive, so we don't want to go bother them if we don't have to. We can use a drone, fly it over. Not as easy as it looks. This probably took like 50 pictures until we actually got the owl. And this one is fairly visible. Sometimes they're much more covered than that. But that just shows you the habitat that they're using, how they blend into the grasses, and how they're not choosing anything that's conspicuous. We don't find that they're going to be like in the tallest clump of grass or the densest section. They may be somewhere that's a little bit taller or a little bit denser, but they don't want to stand out. They want the cover, but they don't want anybody to be able to say, okay, there's probably a shorted owl in that clump. Okay. Here, this deer is going to find a nest and just see what the deer does. So I've seen that on camera from the owl's point of view. Deer sticks its nose into the nest and the owl just kind of snaps its bill and kind of pecks at the deer. And so that's kind of their main defense mechanism, the short-eared owl, is to be camouflaged, to be hidden in the grass. They don't want to give away their location unless they absolutely have to. And so it didn't perceive that deer probably as a predator. And so the owl just stayed put. And so anybody watching, you'd have to watch really closely to be able to see anything that happened there. You just think there's a deer out there, and the owl is still well hidden. Here's a video where we have an eagle, I think, flew by the area, and you'll see what the owl does. I think it'll play again, but watch her face. So kind of cool. We call that concealment posture. And like I was talking about earlier with the ear tufts, they can put them up or down. They can actually control all the feathers in their facial disc and throughout their body, so they can change that shape and manipulate it. And so that owl perceived a threat flying over, so it did its best to blend in with the surroundings, right in the grass. Okay, so on to nesting season. We've talked about the winter, we've talked about the courtship and the spring, and now we're in the egg laying period, which it starts really in mid-March. We've seen nests as early as basically initiating now, but that's pretty uncommon, and goes all the way until the end of July. So it's a pretty long nesting season. And what we do is we look for these grass nests by flushing the birds off them. That's the only way we can find them, is for them to give away their location. So there's two ways to do that. One way is just to make observations, and in the evening, try to see a prey delivery where the male brings food to the nest, or try to see the female leaving the nest. But it's difficult. And then even if you see that, actually getting to that point and finding the actual nest is like a needle in a haystack. So what we do is we have a long rope, like climbing ropes, and we have one person on each end, and we drag the rope through the field, and the rope kind of sits on the top of the grass and sort of makes a wave go through the grass. And when it comes over the owl will flush for the most part. And so that's how we find the nest on top of that spot. So go back. Go back one more. So it starts like this. They lay eggs. They lay about one egg every day, maybe a little bit less. Up to, we've seen 11 or 12 eggs, I think, is our max that we've seen. The average is usually 6 to 9 eggs in each nest. And then they also start to hatch one by one. So here's an egg here that just has a little pip in it. This one is starting to hatch. This chick has just hatched, and this one is probably about 2 days old. And so there's going to be basically one of each age a couple days apart. And there, a couple more have hatched there. These are a little bit older. Those eggs are still waiting to hatch, until eventually you see this, where you have chicks of all different ages. That one there is probably about 10 or 12 days old, down to the littlest one that's probably only 1 or 2 days old. And that strategy is just going to help their survival, having one at a time leave the nest, because they don't actually fly until they've been out of the nest for a while. We'll come back to that. Sometimes, unfortunately, we come back to a nest to check up on it, and what we see is just this egg here that has been pecked and eaten by something, eggshell fragments, no owls, just that the nest has been eaten up by something. And what we looked at was, okay, this seems like we're coming back to the nest and they're always failing. What is going on here? And Denver had data from back in the late 80s and 90s in the same area where he did the same study. And he had this green, it shows you the percent of successful nests versus total nests. So that green line is pretty close. There was more successful nests. And now we have our green line way below the red line. So very few of the nests were successful. And successful just meaning that the chicks got old enough to leave the nest. They didn't necessarily survive, but they survived 2 or 3 weeks old. And this is just another way to look at it. If you don't like looking at data, you don't have to bother. But what I saw out of this is, okay, back in those days, even when we had years with a lot of nests, the green ones, those are high nesting years, we had low failure. Now, even when we have the high nesting years, we have pretty high failure. And a species like this is going to count on those high nesting years where there's a lot of food, there's a lot of resources, and they all have a lot of nests, a lot of chicks. And that kind of behavior can actually cause the population to stay strong. In the years with fewer nests, if they're failing, it's generally maybe not as big as a hit on the population. But if we see those years where the population is high and there's a lot of nests and they're mostly failing, that can start to indicate that there might be a problem going on. So what we decided to do was monitor the nests with cameras, kind of like what we did on the winter roosts as well. This one here is called a snake camera. It's a really tiny camera, like the tip of it is, you know, smaller than a pencil. And these ones are a little bit bigger. So on every nest, we decided to put 2 cameras. The tiny ones we put close to the nest, sometimes within a few feet, sometimes a few yards. And the big ones we put a little bit farther away from the nest so that we had 2 views of the nest. And then we'd set the cameras after finding the nest and we'd leave, and we never had to come back to the nest to disturb it or anything like that. We had a battery, solar powered battery with a DVR and everything running the camera about 200 feet away from the nest. So we could go to that, not disturb the nest, and just have these cameras running the whole time. And over the past 3 summers, we deployed a total of 29 cameras on nests and captured 16 instances of nest failure. So when the nest did not get to that point where the chicks leave the nest to be successful. 9 of those failures that we were able to capture on camera were from predators. 5 were abandonments, meaning the female, for some reason, left the nest and never came back. And 2 were unknown because the cameras weren't working. Here is some of the stuff we saw. I saw the owl flush right when the coyote came into the frame. That hit there is about the most nest defense that you'll see from a short-eared owl. Okay, so that's not all of the footage that I have, but that is all of the predators that we captured. Every single predator was a coyote, which was a little bit of a surprise. We expected to see maybe some ravens, fox, skunk, but it was all coyotes. There were plenty of nests that didn't have cameras that failed that may or may not have been coyotes, but for the most part, the evidence points towards coyotes being the major nest predator. So that was really interesting to find out. And as you saw in some of those videos, like in this first one, the coyote gets pretty close to the nest and then the female flushes. So she's relying on that camouflage. She's waiting until the last second that she needs to get off the nest, or else she's actually going to probably get eaten by the coyote. And we've seen footage where the coyotes are kind of doing these transects themselves, sort of like we do. And they know what it means when a short-eared owl flushes. They know that is a nest, and they can go to the nest and find it. And they'll even work in packs sometimes to cover areas and find these nests. Okay, so this just shows you that we put cams on half the nests. The other half had no cams. That was just my way of checking to make sure that the cameras weren't having any effect, kind of the control group versus the camera group. And what we found from that is that the nests that didn't have cams actually failed more. So we concluded that the cameras weren't causing a nest failure. They may have even been keeping some predators away. And they had more predations, but the ones that had cameras had more abandonments. That's again when the female leaves the nest and doesn't come back. And we know that's partially because the cameras caused the abandonment a few times. Over the course of our study, we saw that a few times, and we were able to modify our methods. So by last year, the 3rd year of our camera study, we didn't have any abandonments from the cameras, but it did take us a couple of years in troubleshooting and working on our methods to make sure that we weren't contributing, which is always a concern when you're doing research, you know, that we want to study them in their wild state and we don't want to have an effect on them. So the cameras did a good job of doing that in the end. And sometimes we saw that the female abandoned the nests and we didn't know why. There's not really a way to tell. Occasionally we found her dead and that's why she abandoned. And sometimes we don't know what happens with the abandonments. And so one thing we're able to look at with the cameras, now that we have verification of a predator that got a nest, we can look at the evidence that they left behind. So here's an example of what an egg looks like when it's been eaten by a coyote. However, here's also a nest that's been preyed upon by a coyote. It has no eggs, nothing in it. It was all chicks that had hatched, but unfortunately none of them made it. They all got eaten by the coyotes. And if you were to find this nest and not know what happened, you might think that it's a successful nest because of the amount of pellets and whitewash and things like that in the nest. And then here's one that we didn't capture any ravens on camera, but we did actually see a raven eating a short-eared owl egg at one point, and we're able to tell that it looks a little bit different. So we were kind of hoping that the cameras would help us to learn more about how to discover what the nest failure cause was without the camera. And it did help us a little bit, but we're also finding that it can look like a lot of different things. And there's not really a cut and dry. Okay, back to those chicks. So we talked about how the chicks all hatch one at a time. And then what they do is they leave the nest one at a time, usually when they're around 15 to 18 days old. They leave on foot. They just walk off into the grass one at a time, and they stay in the grass on foot for a few more weeks until they start to fly a little bit, and then eventually they're making actual flights. And so during that period, they're also really vulnerable. And it's a period that we're not able to study that much, not at all with the cameras. So when we look at nest failures with the cameras, that's just what happened in the nest bowl. And we can't really say if they survived past that. So the nest failures, if you think of it as the actual survival of the chicks to fledging, is probably quite a bit higher, because probably a lot of them do not make it once they're out of the nest. And if you think about it, of the survival to the young actually reproducing themselves in subsequent years, it's even lower. So if we're looking at 60, 70, 80, 90% failure rates just in the nest bowl, and then you add the rest of those failures on, that's kind of indicating that something might be going on there. The video cameras were fun too. We got to document a lot of behaviors that we haven't seen before. Here's the last chick out of a nest leaving. What they'll do is they'll leave and they'll come back a few times until eventually they don't come back. That one left, and the male came with food, and nobody was home.
That's funny.
And this was our post cam, and you can see from the far camera, there's that little chick running to try to get back to get that hole.
Oh.
And then gets back there. And so once the chicks are out of the nest, the male will bring them food to where they are. But while they're still in the nest, the female is usually in there, and she feeds them. We're also able to see behaviors, like there is the female feeding her young chicks. She has 8 or 9 young under her wings. They often do this behavior where they're tenting and creating sort of a shield from the sun for their young. And we see that she tears up the food into little pieces and feeds it to them. Go ahead. And then we can also see, okay, that piece is too big. It can't quite get it down. And as they get older, right about when they're at that point where they're ready to leave the nest is when they can start to swallow larger prey or whole prey. And so they wait until they don't need their prey ripped up anymore, and then they start to leave the nest. Also gets pretty crowded in there. I think it's nicer to leave. Watch this little guy there. Do you guys see what's happening? Can you rewind that one? Yeah. Okay, so there's this little chick here, and it's casting a pellet in the nest.
Oh. It's a big one.
And the female, she does nest sanitation, so she took care of that one right away. And gobbles that up. And so looking at some of those behaviors has helped us, again, learn how to go to a nest without a camera and figure out what has gone on there. So when we go and we see a lot of pellets, that indicates that there was a lot of chicks. They're probably older, and the female, she can't keep up on nest sanitation anymore. But if you go and there's not very many pellets, but there's a few little poops, you can start to figure out, okay, well, the chicks probably hatched, maybe 1 or 2 hatched or something before they all got eaten or the eggs got eaten. So having this data has been really neat. You know, it's almost impossible to see into a short-eared owl nest from afar. Maybe if you had a blind, you could do it, but generally it's really tough. So has been really fun seeing all the footage we can get that's really never been seen before. Here is a female after we placed a cam. This is her coming back for the first time, so she's a little tentative. And to hide the location of the nest, a lot of times they'll land somewhere else and then they'll walk through the grass to get there. And so there she is, walking into her nest. We also got a lot of data that I haven't analyzed yet. That would be a great project for a student or something, on prey delivery rates. So we have all these prey deliveries at multiple nests with cameras. We have when the male brought prey, what he brought. And so it'll start to tell us how much prey they need, what time of day are they hunting and bringing prey and stuff. So cool extra data that we got. There's a close-up of a prey delivery at night. And that's basically it. Male comes, he's usually there from 2 to 7 seconds, 7 being on the longer side, and he just leaves the kid and goes back up hunting. Okay, so why are we doing this? We talked a little bit about learning about the coyotes, learning about other threats to these owls. We know that grasslands are declining throughout the country and all over the world. 50% of grasslands have been lost, and then we're seeing declines in grassland birds due to habitat. But with short-eared owls, what is that habitat that they actually need? So if we can measure what they're using, we'll know what they need. So saying that grasslands are declining may not be very meaningful for the species until we know what height of grass they need, how large of sections do they need, what species are they using that might help us with their conservation. And then finding out what is causing these declines, in particular, predation, nest failure, we knew that, and we've attributed in our area to coyotes so far. And so what does that mean? How can we think about what has changed in the ecosystem over the past 35 years, or even over the past 50 years, that is now increasing the amount of nest failure due to coyotes? And looking at the region and these areas and seeing, wow, there's a lot of grasslands. We're really lucky to have these conservation lands, but they're small and they're fragmented. And there's lots of man-made structures that have been added that provide shelter for coyotes. And there's not as many predators and competition for coyotes as they used to be. So we're just trying to add a little bit more into that big picture to figure out what's going on for the species so we can better conserve them. And so what can you do? We get asked that a lot. One of the things that I think it's important to know and that our data is showing is that their breeding season is a little bit longer than you might expect. And so sometimes areas have closures or people wait to do some haying in their field to try to wait for the nesting season to be over. And we actually see nests initiated from early March all the way up until mid-June. So it's kind of a long period. And then if you have a nest is initiated in mid-June, the young take about a month to hatch, and then they take another month after that until they can fly. So they're really, throughout the summer, there's going to be vulnerable short-eared owl young and eggs out. And so that data can be really important for anybody who has this habitat that they're managing on their own or to share with a management agency to think about that. And here, this photo was taken a couple of years ago in one of the areas right around now. I think this was like early April. And so short-eared owls had already been doing their displays. They had already chosen their territories likely and their mates. And this owl had been seen displaying and then came back and the field had been burned. And so we don't know what happens after that. Can the owl just move across to the next field and nest there? Well, maybe, but probably that territory is already occupied. So it might mean that it has to move somewhere else. And so these are all just things like to think about in conservation of the owls. How do we manage our lands to best support them? Could we do something like burning in the fall when that's possible, when there's no nesting going on, rather than in that early spring period? Other big threats to short-eared owls can be car strikes. We see a lot of that with the fledglings. So having driving slower on roads is something you can do. As well, taking down barbed wire is an important one. The adults and the younger birds often get tangled in barbed wire. And obviously not using rodenticides for raptor is really important. Okay, so hopefully from all this, you've learned maybe a new perspective on short-eared owls, even if you knew a little bit about them, have seen them before. Now you find yourself out in a beautiful field like this. This is one of my favorite places to be in the Mission Valley. In the evening, you're gazing into the sunset and you see a short-eared owl, and you can think about, okay, why is it there? What is it doing? How is it using this habitat? And what are its behaviors telling us? And you'll start to see all these things pop out. So our short-eared owl work was supported by Sitka, who sponsored the cameras, and by Drake Ballard and Dan Ballard, who did a lot of the technological work and made some donations, and Troy, who does a lot of our technology work as well. Wouldn't have been possible without him. I can understand sort of how the cameras work, but I would have never been able to troubleshoot and figure all that out on my own. So it's been really helpful having all that technological support so that we can do our research. Now I'm just going to sneak this in here a little bit. I see some yawns, so you guys are getting a little tired. But also relevant right now, and also one of the species that I mainly study at the Owl Research Institute is the great gray owl. What's the largest owl that we have by height. So if you see a large owl, it might be a great gray owl. And right now they're also gearing up for their nesting season. So they may be hooting and pairing up and selecting nest sites. And that is what we are aiming for. Go ahead, Jess. For great gray owls is to find their nest sites. Here, and we love this photo because it shows you how large that owl actually is with the wingspan. That's Soleil. She's about the same height as me, and the wingspan of the great gray owl is about 5.5 feet. And there's one in hand where you can see how tall that owl is. And so we do some banding as part of our research on great gray owls to look at their nest site use and their survival and everything like that. But our main goal, again, is to find the nests and to study the habitat around the nests so that we can inform conservation. And how we're doing that is in two ways. We find nests by doing sort of your traditional nocturnal callback survey where you go out at night, you play owl calls, you listen for owls, and you record what you're hearing. With great grays, they're not as vocal and they're not as responsive as some of the owls, and their habitat can be a little bit difficult. So we've been able to start using these ARUs to record owl calls. And they're just a small unit here that here's Haley, who's in the back there, hanging one up on a tree, and we leave them out for about a week. And they record everything, and then we're able to look at that data, and it'll tell us what species of owl we're vocalizing within hearing distance of that recorder. Okay, so this here is like a jackpot. A pair of great gray owls. Who knows which one's the male and which one's the female? Largest female, yes, thank you, Rosemary. So that one is a female, that one is the male, like a lot of raptors and all owls. The female is larger, and you can see that pretty well when they're perched together. So we can assume that this is probably a breeding pair. And this was in the spring. And so if anybody sees great gray owls now, I say March through May, we would love to get reports of that. That really helps us be able to find the nests and get all the data that we need. Go ahead, you can contact ORI or go to our website or email me or whatever. And we always say that if you do share your sightings with us or share your nests, like we're not going to share that. We give that data to management agencies and we measure the nests, but that's about the extent of it. So we'd love to have help with that. Like our volunteers, we've had a lot of help from the public in finding these nests, and it really makes our work a lot easier. So what we do after we found the nest of the great grays, that is really fun. It's one of my favorite parts of the study is we get to monitor the nest, and that just involves 1 hour a week away from the nest with a scope where we get to watch the owls and see what they do, see what their behaviors are, and try to figure out when the chicks hatch and how many there are and how old they are so we can get an idea of what their productivity is. And we've also started putting these colored leg flags on the ones that we banned so that we can more easily identify them without having to recapture them. So if you do happen to see one of these or get a photo or see a photo with them, please give us that information. It's really important for us to get that reciting information. And so once we found the nest, we measure what species it is, what is the diameter, what is the height, how about the surrounding habitat characteristics. And we're starting to analyze that data to figure out what tree species and habitats they're using here in our region in Western Montana. And what we've actually found is that about half of the nests that we find for great grays are in snags. The rest are in stick nests. So snags are obviously very important for nests, and by snag, I mean a dead or dying tree with a broken off top that provides a nesting platform or bowl for the owl to go on top. And you know, snags have been kind of around, I guess, in the wildlife world for a while. You know, snags are important to wildlife. What we're learning with great grays in particular is that we need a lot of snags around, and we need to think about that in the long term. So here's a snag that was used as a great gray owl nest. Next year, here it is on the ground. In that same territory, that same pair the year before, same thing happened to their snag. They love using these old, large trees that are also easily prone to blow down, and so they may not last on the landscape that long. And we need to think about the processes that create these snags, such as disease, fungus, insects, lightning, fire, wind, old age, drought, flood, and animals. So I guess what I'm trying to say in that is conserving snags is great, save the snags, but let's also think about how to make more snags. Great gray owls have large territories. They may choose one nest that's a kilometer away from another nest in subsequent years. And we don't know necessarily why they do that, but having those alternate nest sites available for some of these larger species is going to be really important. And that's how we'll translate that to conservation. Giving this data to management, we already share our data with the tribal wildlife and forestry departments, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Forest Service in the state of Montana, and they use our data for logging, planning, and things like that. And so we're hoping that this data will be important to conserving the species in our state. All right, that's all I have for you today. I think on the back table we have our newsletter, which is called The Roost. If you haven't gotten it, pick it up. It's really fun. It has a lot of photos. You can sign up for it on our website. You'll get it once a year in the mail. Usually around Thanksgiving. Go to our website, follow us on social media. We share fun videos and owl facts and stuff like that, and we'd love to stay in touch with you. We have a sign-up sheet, Gina?
Yes, right back there.
We have a sign-up sheet too, so you don't even have to go to the website. You can put your name and email on there, and Gina will get you onto our mailing list if you would like to be on it. Physical address, yes, if you want to receive the newsletter, which I recommend. Okay, Jess. And then this time of year is actually really fun. We have live cameras going on that are just about to be live on owl nests, and then we'll have one probably later on an osprey nest. So if that sounds like fun to you, you can check out explore.org, and we have our whole page on Explore for the Owl Research Institute that shows all our cams, winter roost cam for long-eared owls, and then we'll have a great horned owl nesting cam, maybe a long-eared owl nesting cam. That's fun and free to watch. Okay, thank you for staying awake. Any questions?
Hunting area during the nesting season.
For shorted owls?
Yeah.
Okay, so the question is, how large is the hunting area for shorted owls during the nesting season? I can't say that for sure, but what we see is a variation in that year to year. When there's more owls, more voles, the territories tend to be smaller, but their hunting areas also overlap. Yeah, so we, in like a square kilometer, we may have up to 10 pairs at once, but that would be a lot. Generally, it would be a few hundred meters or more apart.
Are the grasslands grazed with cattle?
Are the grasslands grazed with cattle? For the shorted owls in our study, some of the areas do have grazing rights on them, and yes, and some do not. So we have both areas in our study where we're able to look at areas that do get grazed versus ones that don't.
Is there a measurable impact?
Yes, yes, there is. What we see is that After grazing, we don't have short-eared owl nests for at least 2 to 3 years after that for the grass to come back. And it does depend on how heavily it's grazed and how many years in a row it's grazed. But yeah, absolutely. And occasionally we'll find a nest in an area that right before it's grazed or while it's actively being grazed, and those nests never make it. We've tried fencing them off and it doesn't seem to work too well. Quinn. Why do owls turn their heads? Okay, good question. Well, okay, I want you to try something for a second. Pretend that you can't move your eyeballs and look left and right. So fix your eyeballs in space. How do you look? You have to turn your head to look. And owls can't move their eyeballs left and right, so they have to move their head.
You know that coyotes are the #1 predator and heads off for cattle. I mean, are you just at a point now where you can't fence a nest off for a coyote?
You know, that's not something we've really explored or probably will, maybe as an experimental thing, but it's just not feasible to try to fence off every nest from predators. It would be interesting to see if it worked, I guess, but I think for us, it's more of a bigger picture of like what else could protect.
So the numbers aren't low enough to be like an endangered species.
No, they're not an endangered species, not here. You know, other areas they have disappeared, but so far we see good numbers every year, pretty much, and throughout the year. So, you know, like last year we were monitoring 37 nests, I think. So we can't possibly protect them all with the fence or something. Yeah, unfortunately.
Has anybody been monitoring where the wolves are moving back in, which pushes the coyotes out? Would these be a good source for the wolves if the wolves are coming in?
Yeah, the question is, has anybody been monitoring the wolves where they're coming back in to push coyotes out, and would short-eared owls be a food source for the wolves? Nobody's really monitoring that in our area. The wolves are studied. There are wolves there. We don't often have them out in the prairies. And no, I think it's highly unlikely that wolves would use short-eared owls as a food source. One thing that we see in short-eared owls, and Denver sees it in the snowy owls in Alaska, is that in years where there's a lot of prey, a lot of voles, or a lot of lemmings, there's more survival of everything. So all the ground nesters. And so, for example, here, if there's a lot of voles, the coyotes can fill up pretty easily on voles. They might not spend as much time looking for nests and eggs and things like that. And for a wolf, that's just not really their behavior to do that. So, yeah. Anyone else? Okay, thank you.